Hello everyone, I just want to give you a super quick, or at least as quick as I can, introduction to nonlinear editing and give you a little context for why it's called nonlinear editing and a little bit of history in editing in the briefest amount of time, just so you can have a little sense for where things stand today and where you stand in the pantheon of editing history. Anyway, so the very first editing was editing of actual strips of film, which I have personally never done because by the time I got to editing, we were shooting on video, not on film strips. And so back in that day, as you can imagine, they were literally going through the film and literally cutting the film. And then they would have this like special glue that would allow them to glue the different parts together. And it was, very tangible, also kind of tedious, and not terribly easy to make changes. And it was pretty complicated. I've never done this. I actually own a Super 8 editor, and I have never actually tried to mess with it. I've shot a little bit of Super 8 myself, but it never really interested me to try and literally edit it the old-fashioned way. I just decided that I would basically digitize it into my computer and edit it that way because that's what I knew. So anyway, this is the very first form of editing. And there's still people doing it today here and there, but for the most part, we've gotten away with it because film is so expensive and because it takes so long to get it developed, and it's just incredibly pricey. And then, of course, you can't reuse film. So anyway, very first type of editing would have been film editing, which is sort of, it's sort of what we might call linear editing. It's sort of nonlinear in some ways, actually. But the linear that we are defining ourselves as not doing is actually the type of editing that I started with. And in linear editing, we're shooting on depends on the type of camera you have, but basically like VHS tape was one of the was the type of editor that I would use. Here's a pretty good model for it. And basically what you would do is you would have one VCR. I don't know if you're familiar with VCRs now, but they were boxes that played cassettes. Anyway, you would have one VCR that would where you'd put the raw footage that you'd shot in your camera, and then you would fast forward and rewind through that. And then every once in a while, when you found something you like, you'd hit play, and then you'd put a blank video in a second VCR, and you'd hit record. And you'd record that little bit that you wanted, and then you'd fast forward or rewind wherever to the next part of the raw footage that you shot, hit play, hit record on your VCR, and basically do it that way. Now, they had fancier ways of doing that, and they had some ways of doing dissolves and stuff that could get kind of interesting and complicated. This is one of the video editing tools that similar to what I used to use, and basically you have a controller for the play side, for the record side, and it just makes it a little bit faster. But that's what we call linear editing, because you would have to put down your edits linearly, one after the other. You couldn't skip around really very effectively, and if you wanted to go back and make a change to something, that was a mess. You can see this picture here is sort of highlighting one of the benefits of editing on computers versus editing on linear editors, because this is something you can do. You can go back and put a clip in between. So I don't know if you can really kind of picture that, but if you imagine, you're laying video down on a VHS tape. After you've done that, it's not digital, so there's no way that you can go back in, or even if it was digital because it's on tape, there's no way that you can go back in and insert something that would push everything else over. So it was you had to have a different mindset when you were doing linear editing. You really wanted to have your video more or less edited on paper, or maybe just in your mind, depending on how quickly it, or how long the video was. And then you would go through and lay it down. So there's a lot more thought that had to go into editing before you started. And then as computers got faster and they could store more data, we had nonlinear editing show up. And I love it when we define things by what they aren't. And so technically, technically golf is nonlinear editing because it is not linear editing. But we also, we call it digital video editing, but technically, we had digital video. There's digital video tape. So you could still do linear editing and have it be digital. It could be digital linear editing. But anyway, I digress. So nonlinear editing basically means that we do not have to drop everything down in a line one after another. We can throw some things in, move them all around, change the order very easily. And that was really amazing for video editors like me who'd gotten used to just having to drop things in one at a time. And if you screwed something up, you have to start over, or it was very complicated. One of the other downsides of regular linear editing is every time that you copied footage from one tape to another tape, the quality dropped down a little bit. And so you'd start to, if you're starting with not great footage, it was only going to get worse the more times you copied it over. And so it could be a mess. And there are a lot of ways that you could accidentally really screw up your video and have to start over. So nonlinear editing shows up. The first nonlinear editor was Avid. And Avid has not changed dramatically in the many years that it has been out. Let me see if I can find a pretty decent picture of what Avid looks like. This is all right. Well, not very big. Let's try and find a little bit of a bigger one here. This has got a bunch of fancy windows open. But if you've had a look at Final Cut X, you'll see this is pretty familiar. You can kind of ignore this. They're basically doing some color correction stuff right here. But you've got your area where you have all of your assets, your videos, your pictures, and all that, and they're also storing effects here in Avid. And then you'd have, a viewer where you look at your raw footage, and then you'd have the window where you look at your footage in the timeline and settings and all that sort of stuff. Let me see if there's any ones here that aren't quite so complicated. Yeah, this looks a little bit more like Final Cut X right now. And so Avid was the first one to come around, and so it was a really professional editor, very, very expensive. We did an upgrade back in probably early 2000s. I was working for a college as their video producer, and we wanted to upgrade Avid, and it cost $26,000. I'm just giving you a moment to to absorb that. Fortunately, it wasn't coming out of my pocket. $26,000. As some of you know, I own a DeLorean. My DeLorean cost $29,000. So you could have an Avid upgrade. Basically, by the time that we were doing that upgrade, it was our Avid was so old that we were kind of starting from scratch. But it involved getting new hardware and some other stuff too. But we already had the computer, and so that was just an upgrade. So Avid was kind of the big boss. This is what the pros used for a long time, and Premiere came out, and that was a little bit more affordable. And as you can see, again, the interface pretty similar. This is where you keep your assets. This is where you look at clips, your raw clips. This is where you look at your timeline, and then you got some more clips down here. So as you can see, the layout's fairly similar, which is nice. What that means is if you get really comfortable with one editor, you're going to be a step ahead in other editors. Doesn't mean, and I want to be clear about this, doesn't mean that you can just step into another editor and have it work necessarily. Premiere maybe a little bit more so. Avid will give you a run for your money. So anyway, Premiere was a little bit more affordable than Avid, so people would also use Premiere for nonlinear editing. And then Apple came out with the original Final Cut Pro, which looked like this. And again, you can see similar layout. They call it the browser, viewer, and then the canvas is where you look at your timeline. And the thing about Final Cut Pro was that it was really affordable. The original Final Cut Pro actually came with this thing called Final Cut Studio, which had all these other applications related to it for DVD burning and music, and it was pretty amazing. And Final Cut Pro really gave Avid a massive run for its money. So the price of Avid dropped dramatically as people flocked to Final Cut Pro, professional editors. And so people, Final Cut Pro, the original Final Cut Pro, really revolutionized the cost of editing and made editing something that the more average video producer could do more affordably. Then they came out with Final Cut X, which dramatically changed the software in Final Cut Pro. And originally people really hated it. I'm going to see if I can upload a video to the class website about there's a Conan sketch actually about how bad the original Final Cut X was. But over the years they improved it, and it's, people are sort of forgiving Apple for the mess that they created with Final Cut X. But actually a lot of people went back to Avid. We in the journalism department went back to Avid for a while because Final Cut X had such a bad reputation. And now people are kind of coming back to Final Cut X now as it's improved and seems to be a better application for professionals to use. But the big three when it comes to nonlinear editing are now Final Cut X, Premiere, and Avid. I would group Premiere and Final Cut X as more similar. The original Final Cut Pro is a lot more similar to Premiere than I think Final Cut X is now. And then Avid kind of stands alone as editor for the higher level professionals. And the problem with Avid is it is extremely difficult to learn. In fact, I was proficient in Avid, dropped it for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years, and had trouble getting back into it, even though it had been the editor that I basically learned nonlinear editing on Avid. It's really complicated, really not user-friendly, but also very powerful. So I like to kind of compare Avid. Avid is sort of like a 747, and Premiere and Final Cut maybe are more like corporate jets. They have a lot of assets. They can do some really cool stuff too. But Avid is top of the line. It's also really expensive. It's also more difficult to maintain as a software. It's the price isn't as bad as it used to be, but anyway, it is really tricky to learn. So you're gonna, if you get really comfortable in Final Cut X, you're gonna be able to drop into Premiere and do pretty well. In fact, haven't really used Premiere regularly in probably 20 some years now, but I can actually I've actually had to pop into Premiere for students once in a while, and I can kind of feel my way through because of my experience with Final Cut Pro. So it's much easier to learn, more intuitive, and it works really nicely with the other Adobe products like Photoshop and in particular After Effects, which is an incredibly powerful and amazing video effects program that I would recommend you try out if you can get your hands on it. Pretty tricky, but can do some really amazing things. So we went with Final Cut X. I guess I should Google that here. Get you, although you should know what it looks like. We went with Final Cut X because it is a popular program used by professionals these days. And also, Adobe has been a little bit of jerks about requiring that you pay for their Creative Cloud every month or every year, and that gets a little complicated for the university to come up with that money over and over again. So Final Cut X we're able to just buy outright, which allows us to make sure that we're going to have editors every semester. But we just as easily could have gone with Premiere if the financing had been a little bit different. And so if you're looking at really seriously getting into editing, the more editors you know, the more marketable you're going to be. But if you're if you're really good at Avid, that's going to look great on your resume. But it really will come down to where you're working and what software they're using. So I would recommend get experience on as many editors as you can. Final Cut, the original Final Cut, you probably don't necessarily need to worry about too much. But if you're coming out of school with a proficiency in Final Cut X, familiarity or proficiency with Premiere, and maybe just a basic grasp of Avid, you'd be in pretty solid shape. And I believe we have all three available in our editing labs. Otherwise, as a student, you might be able to get some discounts with that. But if you're just beginning with editing, get really proficient in one first. And then when you pop into another one, you're going to be, like I said, a step ahead. Maybe not in Avid. In Avid, you want to put a bullet through your monitor. So anyway, I recommend don't just jump in and try and mess with Avid, because it is really complicated. And part of the reason it is complicated is because they haven't done a major overhaul of the software, because they don't want to alienate their professionals. And so there's a lot of stuff that's kind of been tacked on to Avid in terms of software that they've added on to the application that doesn't really look like the rest of Avid, and it's definitely knowing Avid can bring you some job security, because it is a tough one to learn. So that's a really, I know we're up to about 17 minutes, but that's a pretty brief introduction to nonlinear editing. Original editing on film, basically you had to put all the clips together in a certain line. You could move things around a little bit. But linear editing, where you're editing from tape deck to tape deck, really basically had to do it in order linearly. Shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, shot 4. You couldn't jump around. And then nonlinear editing, because it's on a computer, allows us to move things around really easily, experiment. You can start with the middle of your project, work your way back. It's really changed the way that we edit in a good way. Maybe it allows for a little bit of sloppiness in some senses too, because you don't necessarily have to come to your project with as thought out a plan as you did when you were doing linear editing. But it's worth it for the freedom to move things around and change things. So that's why we call it nonlinear editing. Again, that means nothing to most people, so that's why we call the class digital video editing. Technically, you could do digital video editing linearly if you wanted to, but nobody's really doing that anymore. If you have any questions, let me know, but that is a brief history and explanation of nonlinear editing.